Did we waste 14 years? This is one of the questions I get most regularly in response to my posts and from people that I meet out and about. How could I have supported what the Conservatives were doing from 2010 to 2024 when we left so many problems? And I think it's worth trying to contextualize this, not to deny that we made mistakes, because we certainly did, and I will discuss those, but to say that a lot of important things were done in those 14 years. Let's start with the Conservatives getting in 2010. Except we didn't, of course. Think back to that meeting in the garden at Downing Street with David Cameron and Nick Clegg. We were beholden to the Lib Dems from 2010 to 2015. We weren't governing on our own. And that meant that we could not have a red-blooded Conservative government. We were never going to be able to. Clegg and his team would not agree to that. They did agree to some things. They agreed to put up tuition fees, but they didn't agree to cut the top rate of tax down to 40p, and they were a drag on what we were trying to do. Nonetheless, some very important things were done. First of all, and here George Osborne deserves some credit, the books were brought back into some degree of balance. Bear in mind, when elected in 2010, £1 of every 4 that the government was spending was being borrowed. Austerity was the right policy. The state could not afford to do what it was doing, and George Osborne, by a mix of tax increases and public expenditure cuts, brought it back under control. This was the right thing to do. Indeed, it was essential, because if George Osborne hadn't followed the austerity plan, we would not have been able to afford the bailouts that we had during COVID. And I'll come back to them, because they weren't perfect, but we needed firepower in 2020 when COVID hit. Whether the firepower was used correctly is a slightly separate matter, but George Osborne meant that some firepower was available. So that's one tick, I think, for the first 5 years of Conservative government. You then have the education reforms spearheaded by Michael Gove and Nick Gibb. These were fundamental, they were exciting, and they were important. We went back to proper educational standards. And this is shown in the figures. If you look at the PISA tables, which are international comparisons, England goes right up those tables for English and for maths during the 2010 to 2024 period. But it's better than that, because normally when governments do X or Y or Z, it's very hard to know how different it would have been if they hadn't, if they'd done something else. There's very rarely a control experiment. With education policy, there is. Because while England went with the Gove-Gibb reforms, Scotland and Wales were going in the other direction. They had their devolved assemblies or parliaments, and they were moving in a left-wing direction entirely antithetic to what Gove was doing. And what happened? Well, both Scotland and Wales declined in those tables. Scotland particularly tragic because it had historically had such a good education system, but by following left-wing nostrums, Scottish education clearly and obviously failed. And that's really important to remember when you look at the success of education policy in England. We have a better educated society because of those reforms, and that is going to be a more economically competitive one. Really important changes brought in following Conservative policy 2010 to 2015. Another area where we did well, we did things that were important, Ian Duncan Smith's welfare reforms, the introduction of the universal credit, a system that gives people more responsibility for their lives, but crucially also helps to make work pay. Making work pay is so important. One of the things I found most educational for myself was being the Conservative candidate in all places Central Fife in 1997. It was there that I really got to understand about the poverty trap, the trap that people fell into when they were dependent upon benefits, and yet if they wanted to go out to work, they would lose over 90% of their benefits as they did so. This meant that it really wasn't worth going out to work, particularly not to get a starter job, that first job that gets you into employment. The universal credit changed that. The same was true with the reforms to the personal independence payments, PIP, which initially were very effective because everyone who was switching from earlier benefits to PIP was tested to see that they were genuinely disabled. And that was run very successfully. There were inevitably some hard cases. Some came to me as a Member of Parliament, but actually over 90% of the cases were correctly determined, and the number of people claiming disability benefits declined sharply because those who were playing the system left the system. So you not only saved money, but you also gave support to people who did it. Those welfare reforms were fundamental and have been at least a starting point for further reforms that would now be possible if only this government had the gumption to do it. So those are two areas of social policy where the coalition government was really very good. It got things right. There was also a health reform, which wasn't particularly successful. It got watered down by the Lib Dems as it went through Parliament. Indeed, they tried to reverse it altogether. I did my longest filibuster in a committee stage to try and stop all the reforms being reversed. I think the total of my speeches, which were interrupted by divisions and things, was 4 hours. Now, I'm not going to go on that long today. They weren't particularly successful, but if you compare England to Wales and Scotland, once again you see that waiting lists were lower in England than in Wales or Scotland, and outcomes better. So although I'm not going to advocate these as being hugely successful or transformative, they still were better than what was going on in other parts of the country under left-wing administrations. I think this is not altogether a bad balance sheet for the first 5 years, some really important things done. And then you move to the 2015 election with that fundamental promise. By 2015, the economy has calmed down. By 2015, we are a governable country that is living broadly within our means. It's not a bad position to be in. And by 2015, David Cameron goes to the electorate promising a referendum. Now, David Cameron's policy was an utter failure. I make no bones about that, and I didn't support it. I supported the referendum, but I didn't support his renegotiation result because I thought, as I said at the time, he came back with thin gruel. From his point of view, the policy did not work, but we had that wonderful, historic vote to leave the European Union that no other party would have given us. That is something that it's worth remembering. That big constitutional change, I think the biggest constitutional change since 1688, was delivered because we had a Conservative government. In 2015, UKIP had no chance of winning an election. There was nobody else who would do it. And then you get a very difficult time in government because you have a governing party led by Theresa May who didn't actually believe in the policy that she was implementing. So absolutely, I accept the period between 2016, when we voted for Brexit, and 2019, when Boris came in, was not successful. I don't think it was a very conservative period of government. We didn't, from 2017, have an overall majority. We were dependent upon the DUP. And we did really stupid things like putting net zero into law at the end of that period. It was a bad patch for conservatism, with, to my mind, somebody who wasn't willing to deliver on what the country had voted for. So I accept that that is a blot on our period of office. Then we get 2019. Boris is elected leader of the party and then wins a general election. And this is where a lot of the criticism comes in. It says that majority was wasted. Things weren't done with it. The first few months were very difficult. We could never be certain of winning any votes. There was no possibility of putting through radical policies. There was no majority for anything. Indeed, the majority of that parliament, the majority of MPs, still wanted to be in the European Union and were still trying to frustrate Brexit. Boris cut the Gordian knot with the general election in December 2019 to get Brexit done, which he did. As I said, Brexit is the most fundamental constitutional change since 1688. A real and significant achievement of the Conservative Party of Boris Johnson. But as we leave, what happens? COVID hits. And COVID is really difficult. And I have a lot of sympathy with the Prime Minister of the time, because he was being told by Chris Whitty and Ian Vallance that if he didn't close things down, people would die. As it happens, after the first lockdown, I thought that was a mistake. And I argued that we should open things up and we should not close them down again, and that we should follow Sweden. But the Prime Minister was being told he would kill people if he didn't follow the advice of the Chief Scientific and the Chief Medical Officer. And I put it to you, what would you have done in those circumstances? Would you really have ignored that advice and taken onto your shoulders the deaths of potentially hundreds of thousands of people? We were being told 500,000 people might die because of COVID. Would you really accept the moral responsibility for that? See, I was putting the argument for not shutting down, not locking down further. But I wasn't the one making the decision. It was relatively easy for me to make that case. Would I have done the same as Boris, against my instincts, against what I thought was right, because of what the people who were meant to know about it were telling me? I think history shows that they were wrong. History shows that the lockdowns were a mistake. But you govern in the present, you don't govern with hindsight. And you could say something similar about the schemes that were introduced to protect the economy. I think most of them were absolutely right. If you are shutting down, it's the shutting down that is the mistake, not the then saving of jobs and of businesses. If you tell a business it can't trade, you have to give it the money that it would have had if it had been trading. You have to try and keep people in their jobs. We would have had an economic slump that would have been worse than anything we had seen since America in the 1930s, not the British experience, which was much gentler in the 1930s. It would have been utter catastrophe. So it may have been wrong to shut down, but if you were shutting down, you had to support. On the margins, absolutely things went wrong. I think Eat Out, Help Out was a daft policy. I think I've still got sitting in this house somewhere stickers I was meant to hand out to people encouraging them to do it, which I never did because I didn't think it was a very clever policy. I didn't think taxpayers should be subsidising people's dining habits, and it was also open to enormous amounts of fraud. And fraud was a problem, as was the contracts that were awarded for PPE. But that wasn't easy, because at the time everybody was saying, you must have more PPE. And anyone who got in touch saying they could provide PPE was a hero because it was needed. Masses was then overordered because the disease turned out to be transmitted in a different way from people knew. But it was not done in bad faith. Same was true with the production of ventilators. Huge numbers of ventilators were produced, I think 20,000, most of which weren't needed. But that was because we didn't know what the extent of the problem was. So I think the mistakes over COVID, though some of them were serious, were made in good faith and were understandable. But they had an economic cost. They meant that taxation rose because the money that was spent had to be paid for one way or another. And they led to discontent. Almost every government that imposed lockdowns lost an ensuing election. And we made the stupid mistake of getting rid of Boris Johnson. I said it was a mistake at the time. I still think it was a mistake because he had a mandate from you, the British people, and it was taken away by a clique of MPs. And then, yes, I absolutely accept that the period from 2022 to 2024 was chaotic. I think the conspiracies against Boris were stupid. I thought the Privileges Committee was absurd, and Conservative MPs who were involved with that fell for a Labour trap out of naivety and to some extent self-regard. I also think that the way people within the party determined that they wanted to lead themselves didn't do the party any credit. And that meant that the last couple of years we had no sense of direction. So yes, I accept that we did not cover ourselves in glory at that point. But was 14 years wasted? Well, would you have rather have had Gordon Brown for 14 years? Would you rather have had a country that was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy because of their spending plans, taxation that would have been higher? Would you have liked to have the COVID lockdowns run by Jeremy Corbyn, who would have loved locking everybody down and running your lives because he's a socialist and that's what socialists do? Would you have preferred to have Brexit not even voted on, let alone not delivered. So yes, if you're a wild Remainer, if you're an avid pro-European, the 14 years were a disaster because they did something of such importance. If you're a socialist, they weren't great. But if you're a conservative, I think the balance sheet is not too bad. There are blots on it. There are mistakes. There are leaders who did not do as well as I would have liked them to do. But education for the next generation, welfare reform, financial stability, and Brexit aren't too bad a record over 14 years. And therefore I think Conservatives shouldn't be so ashamed of what we did, shouldn't be too apologetic. And you'll know I haven't mentioned immigration. So let me just mention immigration in passing. First of all, that promise of 10,000 a year, given prior to the 2010 election, was a mistake. Because it wasn't true. That there was no way of sticking to tens of thousands as long as we were in the European Union. What happened later is more understandable because when COVID ended, it was thought that the British labour market was utterly broken and that people had got used to being on furlough or working from home and weren't going to work again, and that we needed, therefore, people to come in from overseas. And the points-based system was set too generously. On top of that, we took hundreds of thousands of people, in my view rightly, from both Hong Kong, British nationals overseas, and Ukraine. That meant a phenomenal number came in post-2022. That was too many and more than we could absorb. It was a mistake, but it was from good intention rather than bad. It was from a mistaken view of the consequences of COVID rather than a government wanting to change society. When Blair opened the floodgates for immigration, he wanted to change the culture of our nation. When we did it, we didn't. We just wanted to make sure the economy ticked over and didn't go into a slump. So yes, I accept mistakes, but overall it was well-intentioned and we were better off in 2024 than we were in 2020. We were more solvent, a stronger country, and with the ability to do things, as we showed by Boris's support for Ukraine, which without him would have been rolled up by Russia in a fortnight. So if you're a Tory, don't apologise too much. If you've left the Tories for reform, don't be too harsh on us. We are broadly on the same side. If you're a socialist and you've listened this far, God bless you, I'm amazed, and thank you. And to all the others who've listened as well.